Okay, so let me just check one more thing here. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing what I am seeing. If you're not, please let me know. Our presentation today is on complex behavior, always a topic. And let's just get started. So I'll just start with explaining who I am. If we haven't had the chance to meet, I'm Adrien Lavoie. I'm one of the psychologists with Chinook's Edge. I joined the team this year in September. However, I did teach at River Valley about 10 years ago. So I have been with Chinook's Edge in the past. And then some of you may also be aware that I was a student here way back in the day at Poplar Ridge. So I've got some history. My portfolio, I am dealing only with students' social, emotional needs, mental health, behavior concerns. I don't do academic counseling or academic assessment. So that does make my role a little bit different than what you might have been used to in the past. You might see me involved in high-risk meetings, student of concern meetings, student consults, observations, and then also violent threat risk assessment interactions. So that's me in a nutshell. And that brings us to our topic of complex behavior. And the first thing I wanted to do was just point out how difficult it is to define complex behavior. There's a lot of definitions out there, and I think the one I want to work with is any behavior that disrupts the flow, and any behavior where it's not readily available easily to see why that behavior is happening. So it's really difficult to say why a student does that, and I think that makes it complex as well. It's pretty hard to say that anything doesn't fit, but I have a few examples of behaviors that you have probably come across that I think fit in this category. It's not an inclusive list, but here we go. Here's some examples. So the first one I've got, shutting down.
Sorry, a lot of us can only see your face.
Ooh, let's fix that.
See the presentation.
Thanks for the heads up. Let's try to fix it. Okay, would someone let me know if they can now see my presentation?
It's there now.
Yay! Thank you to whoever that was. So the only thing you've missed is me starting this first slide and then moving into some examples. So let me just go to present mode here. This will be a bit smoother. Sorry, team, it seems to have frozen on me. I'm going to run the risk of reloading. Oh, no, maybe I won't. Okay. Okay, let's try this again. Yay, it's responding. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first one I've got is shutting down. And basically that student is saying, I don't want to have anything to do with you. I'm not making eye contact. I'm not speaking with you. My next example is running full out pace with the intention of not being caught or found. Though I must admit that I have seen some who really want to be chased, who do want to be caught or want to be found. So you can get a variety of motivators there. Next one I've got is agitation. So somebody who is really fidgety, lacking focus, can't sit still. Sometimes you see repetitive behaviors. And sometimes those behaviors are just annoying. Other times they are self-injurious, or they really interfere with the teacher or other students, or even threaten safety. So those are tricky. The next one I've got is physical aggression. And this list can go on. Punching, kicking, pinching, slapping, and it can be to self, others, peers, teachers. Verbal aggression. So this one can be loud, interruptive, swearing, challenging, defiant, high impact language. Just the more vulgar they can get, the better. It allows for more attention, I suppose. And then I've got the example of threats. So students will sometimes threaten themselves, they'll threaten others, and they'll do this through gestures. Sometimes it's verbal, sometimes it's written or on social media. And if it's extreme, that's one example where my team might get involved with the violent threat risk assessment. Okay, like I said, there are others there, but I just wanted to share a few examples to help flesh out what we're talking about when we are speaking of complex behaviors. So I'm just going to check questions for a second and make sure that there's no other issues that are happening here. Okay, good. Nothing yet that I've missed. Just a note, people were asking me for slides or slide notes beforehand, and unfortunately Prezi won't let that, which is a real bummer. So my next presentation I will do on slides. It seems to work better with Google Hangout, and it allows me to share notes beforehand. So I promise that is coming if anyone wants to join me in a future session. So then now moving into needs or motivators. So what I'm trying to get at is, what is behind the behavior? What is the student trying to get out of their behavior? And I have a picture of an iceberg here, just because I think that an iceberg is a nice illustration of behavior, in that we see something on the surface, but often the need underneath looks very different. It's more complex. It's maybe bigger than we anticipated. So I just like that visual as a way of thinking about it. So the first one I've got, and I've written it sort of in the first person as if I'm the student, as to what they might say if they could explain. So just an experience of being overwhelmed. I'm not regulated. It's fight, flight, or freeze. The next one I've got is self-esteem. I'm not good enough, smart enough, perceived failure is on the horizon. So sometimes students really are struggling with their capacity, their ability to do something. And sometimes it's just their perception. They don't feel they're capable, but they really are. So in this case, it's often very much about how they see themselves rather than how others see them or experience them. Social status. I will be judged and rejected by my important people, whether that's friends, family, or teachers. Sometimes you'll see behavior because they think that it might be impressing somebody. Sometimes it's a way of avoiding looking stupid, or it's a way of trying to get membership into a group of friends that they've always wanted to be a part of. So I think sometimes that drives behavior. The next one I've got is external factors. My outside life is leaking into my school life. For example, divorce, domestic issues, legal involvement, grief, financial issues, or any sort of major life change. I find that a lot of students are really good at compartmentalizing and leaving that stuff at home, and using school as sort of a place to let loose and unwind, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they can't help but bring this stuff to school. Next one I've got, lack of belonging. I don't feel valued, respected, or wanted. And so this one's very similar to peer acceptance, except I think this one might more apply to, say, a student who's moved to the community in the beginning of the year, and they're new not only to the school and the staff, but their neighborhood, their community, and they're just not sure where they belong. They feel like they don't fit, and they're often missing where they came from and feel like nothing can be as good as where they came from, or they don't want to put out the effort to try to make it as good as where they came from. So just trying to differentiate between the two of those. Basic needs. I'm sure this one comes up a lot. I have not eaten, slept, or felt safe in the last 24 hours. So as you can imagine, learning is pretty tricky when this is the case. Loss of control. I feel trapped. I have no choices. So whether this is a physical corner or more of a mental corner, they feel like they have nowhere to go. And the behavior is often a way of creating choice. And as staff, we often feel like they have lots of choices and we don't understand why they feel trapped. So again, it's very much a personal experience. But I find that if I reflect on the experiences in my past, their behavior often did provide choice, or more choice than they had before. Medical reasons behind behavior. So there is an imbalance in my body's chemistry. I'm hardwired different. I'm sick. I'm in pain. And this one is particularly tricky for students who don't have the words, the developmental vocabulary, or the maturity, the emotional maturity to talk about it. So they express it in other ways. It comes out as behavior. And then this one I threw in there as a consideration. What about this behavior has worked in the past to get me out of work? And I see this happening all the time. I'm sure you have too. If I do this behavior, I won't have to do this work. However, I do think it's a good idea to dig a little bit deeper. Why does the student not want to do work? Why are they not motivated here at school? Why is this hard? And I think what you'll find is that one of the other motivators or needs that I mentioned usually falls into place. So they don't feel capable, or they're just too exhausted to focus. So it's a legitimate one, but I would say it's more on the surface of the iceberg, and there's still more to dig into in terms of underneath the iceberg. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, there's probably a few I'm missing here. One that I think warrants a circle that I haven't given a circle to yet is, I kind of spoke to it with medical, the inability to communicate. So you'll see students with big behaviors when they want to communicate and they don't know how. And so their behavior is their best way of communicating. So I'll just get out of present mode for a second and check to see if there's any questions. Looks like nothing yet, so I'll keep going. So that brings us to directions to consider. So perhaps you've seen the behavior, perhaps you have some theories about what it's about. Now, what can you do next? What's sort of the next step? So I thought I would put a picture in here of the kite. I suspect some of you have seen it many, many times, and maybe others of you are less familiar. I'm relatively new to the kite, and I've seen it used in two different ways. One way is a way of organizing staff. It's a response model for a student who is tricky when they have their behaviors. So you might have a primary person who is assigned to them. And then you have a secondary person that you can call upon to help you, and sometimes even a third or a fourth, or a plan B, C, and D, depending on the situation that you're in. So I've seen the kite as a way of organizing staff. And then the other way I've seen the kite used is a way of fleshing out, getting into more detail and documenting what a student's escalation pathway looks like. So in the pink here, you would list triggers that are known for this student. And then in the orange section, it's more about what does the student look like when they start to escalate? What are our warning signs? And then what does peak look like? And then in order to bring them back down, what are some great tools that you can access, whether it's people, places, or things? And then how best to facilitate recovery and return to calm or baseline. So this is a tool to consider when trying to figure out what to do with these kiddos and their behavior. And so now I just have a few questions to reflect on in terms of what you can do to support these students. So the first question I've got is now a good time to talk? So I wouldn't say that this is for peak behavior. This is more when you see students just start to escalate. And you might want to try affirming their suffering, trying to label their emotions for them because sometimes they don't have the words. Maybe it's about giving them choices, saying, I see that you can't learn right now, so why don't we do this or this in order to calm down? And then the other direction you can take, if it works for that student, is offering to listen while they speak and just sort of giving them the floor to talk about whatever it is they need to talk about. Another reflection question is now a good time to redirect or distract? So sometimes you can use their passions, their hobbies, something that they're looking forward to, something they're excited about, and get them off of their escalation pathway. Probably the most common one I come across is food. It can sometimes be a great distraction and stop a student from becoming more agitated. This is always a good question to ask. Is now a good time to follow? And I feel like some of the factors that you need to consider is that student safe? How close do I need to stay to them to ensure their safety? If they're wanting to run, they're obviously wanting some choice and maybe some space, or maybe to be chased. So how can I give them that? And I think I said this already. How close do you get? How close can you go without spurring them on to run faster and farther? Next reflection question, is now a good time to offer basic needs? So perhaps they need to have a sleep. Perhaps they cannot learn today until they've had some sleep because they haven't in the last 24 hours. Or maybe it's some reassurance or some tactile things, some relationship pieces, or even food. Is now a good time to seek help? So in the moment, I feel like the answer is always yes, but this is more of a reflection time for afterwards. And so just wondering about where is the team at with this kiddo? Does everybody know what's happening? Does everybody have the most up-to-date stories? If this student is new to the school and perhaps new to the division, what can we find out about their history? What is in their file? Maybe they're just from a feeder school and we can contact and find out what's been going on there. Is there any outside community involvement? Can we do some collaboration? So just questions sort of ask the learning team if people are stuck in a rut and don't know how to move forward. When I say learning team, I think I'm referring to any staff that work with a student. So educational assistants, teacher, learning support team, administration, and then, like I said, sometimes there's involvement with occupational therapy or physiotherapy or psychology myself. And so that brings me to the last question of, has the school done everything that they can do? And do we need to consider seeking help sort of above and beyond? And then here's a question that's always a tricky one. Is now a good time to remove them from the classroom? So sometimes when students escalate, it's best that they not be there and they need an alternative space. And sometimes it means moving the students because the target student is unresponsive and being. Sometimes it means a break from the classroom. Sometimes it means going home. And in extreme situations, it involves outside services such as RCMP or medical assistance. And I always feel like these are tricky for schools because they're not decisions that come across people such as yourselves very often. And it's very hard in the moment to know when that line has been crossed. So as EAs, if you feel like students are approaching that line, it's always a good question to ask of, if this student goes so far as to reach that line, what does it look like, so we can be prepared and we all agree on when we've reached that line. We all agree that it looks the same way. And then I always like to bring this one up. I guess I'm playing devil's advocate. Is now a good time to get my pound of flesh? And I put, the answer is almost always no, and the answer is almost never, never. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the moment, it's not a good idea to bring up the original issue, and I'm sure you all know that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't discuss it with them later. And when they are at baseline and calm and ready to talk about it, there can be a place for consequences. There can be a place for apologies and cleaning up messes. I think it's all about being intentional and timely and having the team behind you when you do it. Okay, I'm just going to check my questions again, make sure I'm not missing anything. Nope, nothing there. Please don't hesitate to type in a few questions. I'm happy to answer them. Get back to the presentation here. So this brings us to the topic of peak. And so when I'm referring to peak, I'm talking about the tip of the kite. When you think of some of the kids you work with, we're talking about their most extreme behaviors. And sometimes that target is a moving target. So from month to month or season to season, the intensity of their behaviors can change. And so it can be hard to predict. But I went ahead and listed a few examples, just again to try to illustrate what are some of the things we experience when students reach peak. So it can look like hurting themselves, hurting others, destroying and throwing things, swearing, insulting, running, crying, screaming, being unresponsive, curling into a ball, and hiding. And if you think of fight, flight, freeze, which is our brain's response when we feel threatened, you can put each of those examples into one of those categories. And I think for the purpose of this presentation, I'm mostly focusing on those kiddos who turn to fight as their defense. I touch a little bit on flight and even less on freeze. I almost feel like they are topics of their own and could warrant a presentation of their own. So you'll see they're all difficult, they're all complex, but you'll see that I am kind of focusing on those who fight back. So before we get into more of the concrete stuff, I just want to acknowledge how difficult it is to deal with students when they are at peak. And I think there's a number of reasons as to why that is. And I just wanted to acknowledge them because I feel like we can be very hard on ourselves when you go through a critical incident with a student and you come out on the other side and you reflect on what you should have done or shouldn't have done. You often can come up with lots of things that should have been done differently, but don't be too hard on yourself, because even if you've had experience dealing with kids in peak, I don't know that it ever gets easy. And I don't know if it ever goes really well or smoothly. It's messy. So here are some reasons why I think it's particularly difficult. So the first one I have is parenting instincts. Whether you have children of your own or not, I feel like we all as adults have parenting instincts. And we all have things that we automatically would do if it were our own children or perhaps our family or relatives. And sometimes those responses are not appropriate for school. So consciously recognizing that and remembering it to turn that off and do something different is really hard to do in the moment. And that brings me to my second point, fight or flight. If you have a student in fight or flight, it usually brings us to fight or flight as well. It's pretty hard to not also feel threatened or to be concerned about the safety of other staff members or other students. So when your brain goes to fight or flight, its sole focus is on keeping you and others safe. And so the problem-solving parts of your brain, the executive functioning, really gets turned off or minimized. So it's hard to problem solve in these moments. My third point, you're not an observer. Wouldn't it be lovely to be an observer? When you're in the middle of the mess, it's really hard to keep track of whether a trigger has occurred, what was the first point of escalation, where are all the moving parts. Whereas if you're on the side and you have sort of a full perspective, it's a lot easier to see where things go wrong or sideways. But in the middle, to be a problem solver, that's tricky. And then finally, I just wanted to make the point that it often happens very fast. We're talking seconds. And so although we're all professionals and good at what we do, it's hard to keep up with the pace and be responsible for all of those things that are in the environment. So I just want to acknowledge the difficulties of this before we get into some of the do's and don'ts. Okay, so here's my list of what to-dos. It's not all inclusive. I'm sure I'm missing some. And I think most of them you would agree with and wouldn't come as a surprise. I just think it's good to have them all in one place and go over them. And maybe while I'm doing that, you can think of some of the situations you have been in the past and whether these applied or not, or whether they were unique and there was an exception to one of these. So the first one I have is defensive stance. So you don't have a thermometer for each kid to see when they're escalating. And sometimes their behavior is really loud and you can see them moving up in their steps, and sometimes you can't. And so to maintain a defensive stance early in the stage is better than sort of waiting until it's too late, if that makes sense. Giving the student lots of space. So considering how far is their arm reach, how far is their kicking space or their head bunting space, and trying very hard to keep yourself and others out of it. Hands off unless harm to someone is imminent. This is always a big discussion point, and there's lots of what ifs, and I probably can't answer them all, and I don't have the answers for all of them. But the idea is, and the division's stance on this is, that we put hands on students when there is concern for imminent harm. If there isn't, we need to find another way of doing it. Next one, removing objects that could be used to harm. So I've seen anything from furniture to flying projectiles, and so it's hard to consider all of them. And if you have a student who has a pattern of using objects, the consideration becomes perhaps we need to do some prevention work and remove things from their learning environment beforehand. And then removing people, whether that's staff or students, making sure other people are safe, accessing comm tools if they're readily available, and then calling for help so that you are not trying to mitigate the situation in isolation. Okay, that brings me to my what not to do list. And again, it's not an all-inclusive list, and no doubt some of them are debatable, and I wish we were in physical proximity so we could talk about these more, because I'd love to hear some of the examples that you could all bring to the table. Would definitely enrich the conversation. Anyways, doing the best with what we've got. Try not to block their path with your body. I feel like this is a parenting instinct. I know I do it with my kids all the time. And it can end badly. So if you can, prevent yourself from going to that one. Physically moving them, guiding them with touch, and restraint. All of those are tricky and should only be accessed if you are concerned about imminent danger to somebody. Protecting precious objects And this one is tough because we all know how much eyeglasses cost and iPhones and computers, but it is better to sacrifice those things rather than someone. But hard to remember consciously in the moment. I have fallen victim to that one myself. Verbalizing instructions. If you have a few words you want to say, like stop, that's okay. But when you get into long sentences, that part of their brain is just not online. And so it can escalate them if they hear a lot of verbal talking at them. Leave them unsupervised. This one's tricky because often people will leave to go get help, but somebody should stay with them just to keep eyes on and monitor safety. This one seems like a given. Open your body for attack. Don't do that. But I have been caught in that situation. I turned my back on a kiddo once who I thought was calm, was showing signs of being calm. And she jumped out and kicked me in the back of my legs so hard. And I didn't see it coming because I was facing the other way. So just sort of being aware of where your body is in proximity to them and what parts of your body are vulnerable. Try to keep them away. I know nonviolent crisis intervention tries to teach that, but it's tricky to remember if you're not practicing them on a regular basis. Try not to attempt to catch up to them when they're fleeing. Follow them, keep them safe, but in catching up to them, that often escalates them and they will run faster or farther. Again, if it's a safety issue and they are heading somewhere that's going to end in them getting hurt, then yes, please do try to catch up to them. And then finally, bringing up the original issue. This one always makes me laugh because I do it with my own children at home all the time. When I'm trying to justify my decisions, I'll say, well, it's because you did this, this, and this. And we do need to process those things with them, but not in the moment. And it's really hard to resist that sometimes, especially for me. I want to justify my decisions, and I have to remember to just wait. So if you're ever wondering where the division keeps their directive on this, maybe you're in a debate with somebody, or maybe someone asked the question of, where is this written as to how we're supposed to deal with students in terms of hands-on? So if you go to quick links on the division website and you go to the administrative handbook, you will see administrative procedures in there. And there's one called student conduct. And if you scroll down, number 9 addresses it when it says, for the protection of staff and students in the division, and to prevent potentially violent behaviors, school staff may, in specific circumstances, be required to use reasonable measures, including restraint, to manage or subdue a student in extreme cases, and not on an ongoing basis, who is out of control or unresponsive to direction, or where lack of intervention would expose the students or others in the vicinity to harm. So if I can put that in a little bit more simple speak, it's okay to do when there is a safety issue, but it's not okay to rely on or make it a practice. And if you're finding that there's a pattern of always needing to do that, then going to the learning team and saying, we need to come up with a plan because what we're doing is not working. So there it is. People often ask me where exactly the directive is. So I thought I'd just cut and paste it in. And then here's a few that are often up for debate. And again, there's probably more, but here's 3 that I chose. Is moving to a safer location. Should you do that? Sometimes the moving is more risky than the staying, and you have to consider, what does the journey look like to the new space? Who are you going to pass? What are you going to pass? And is it part of a plan that's already been thought about consciously, or is it an in-the-moment decision? Another one that depends is using visuals. I'm a supporter of visuals. I like visuals, but if you're trying to use visuals for the first time, during an extreme situation with big behaviors is not a good idea. You want to introduce the tool when they're calm, so that you're going to have more chances of success when you do it when they're escalating. And then the third one, this one's tricky for me because I'm such a verbalizer. Speak in a low, soothing voice. This is sort of my default, but I've found that no matter how soft your voice is or how calm you are or how slow you go, sometimes talking can be a trigger. So it really depends on the student. And you'll probably learn that quickly as you get to know the student. Okay, we're bouncing around a little bit here. Let me just bring us out. And I want to check my questions because I realize I've probably talked about a touchy subject. So I've got a question here of what if the child is in the safest place? Example, you've already removed the children and objects from their path, but they want to leave the space. How do you recommend keeping them in the space if you don't block them from leaving with your body? Yes, this one is so tricky. What to say about that? So I have seen some schools will use a room with a window, and so they will leave the room in order to protect themselves, but still be able to keep eyes on them through the window. I think you really want to avoid putting somebody in a room by themselves when you can't see them. And I would say that if there is no door and no way of letting them, of preventing them from running, I would consider maybe letting them run. And that is tricky because then you're concerned that they will find someone else or something else to get into trouble with. But I wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself just because you think they're going to run, because running isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be. If you can, planning with that student when they're calm, places that they can run to. So if fleeing is one of their default modes when they feel threatened, maybe you can design a place for them to go to that you can predict that they will go to. Another thing is if this is a repeated behavior, making sure that the team is getting together to talk about how it can be handled, because that's really tricky. And I would want a team behind you on that one. So I hope that is an ample answer. Moving to our next section. I labeled this one bridging, and what I'm referring to is that time when students return after a critical incident. So whether they've been out of the class for an hour, or whether they've been gone on an in-school suspension for a day or two, or whether they have been out of school, let alone their classroom, for a few days, maybe for a suspension or another reason. I think that it's important to really be conscientious about how you set up their return. And I've seen a number of behaviors when students return. Some are completely oblivious to the damage they've done and haven't even considered that it might affect relationships, and they're happy to come back. Others are very concerned. They feel embarrassment or shame about their behavior. They feel that they'll be seen as a bad person, and so they're really scared about coming back. I've seen some students who, when they return, their first MO is to reject you first so that you can't reject them, and that is a way of protecting themselves. So there's a few things that I thought I would bring up that you can do to try to make the return more successful, because I think it's sort of a crossroads where things can go really well when they return, or you can go back to difficult behaviors right from the get-go when they come back. So I've got a picture here of a piggy bank, and the reason I put it there was to remind me to tell you about a professor that I had who said that relationships is very much like putting coins in a bank, and you can't take coins out unless you put coins in. And so coins in is the building of the relationship. It's working on trust, respect, having good times together, getting to know each other, deepening the relationship. And coins out is perhaps pushing them or challenging them, being able to be the person who can question them about their behavior and them feeling safe enough to be honest with you, asking them to do a task that they feel they can't do or they're scared. And I really feel that if you have relationship and you've put the investment in the coins in, this bridging process can go a lot better. So the first thing to consider is when they return, how can we make it intentional? So talking with the learning team about who will they see first, where will this happen, what's their first activity, perhaps they need to have a soft entry, maybe they hang out with one person rather than throwing them into a classroom with all of the moving parts that are there, so that they can just kind of acclimatize to being back. And you don't have to worry about peers being unpredictable and rejecting them. That their first points of contact can be staff who will be very excited to see them. The next one I've got is just making sure that you have thought about how you will personally say to them, welcome back. And schools are a very fast-paced environment, so sometimes it's just spending a little bit of time thinking about how you want to do that to make sure it happens, because a day at school is a very full day, and I have no doubt that I don't need to tell you that. Here's one to consider to bring up with the learning team: creating a bigger role outside of the classroom to build relationships and capacity. I feel like this can do two things. If they have people outside of the classroom who know them and love them, if they have a rough day in the classroom, then there's always other people they can have a fresh start with, who will be happy to see them and don't have the heaviness of maybe a bad morning start. The other thing that outside roles can do is build esteem and build capacity. So if they feel bad or ashamed about something that happened in the classroom, they can maybe feel good about how they contributed to the community. And how they're an expert at something else, even though perhaps there are other parts of their lives that are really difficult. Educating other students and staff about what has happened. So sometimes it makes sense to explain to others what happened, why it happened, and what are we doing to keep everybody safe. And so just being intentional about what language is going to be used, how much is going to be shared, who's going to do it, and maybe even involving the parents or the child if they're developmentally old enough, to talk about what they can share or what they can't, just so we're respecting privacy, but also seeking to gain more understanding and acceptance from the school community, peers, and staff. And then here's another idea to consider for the learning team: a phone call home to speak to the students or the parents to reassure that all is well. So sometimes it's the parents that need the reassurance. They are worried that their child will not be accepted when they go back, that damage has been done. And so if the parent is reassured, often they can be part of the plan to reassure the student that when they go back, everything will be okay. And then it also just helps with overall relationship between school and parents too, I find. Okay, so that's the topic of bridging. I'll just quickly check my questions again to see if anybody has thought of one. One question here reads, what about students who will be ready to return to class, as in they are regulated, but the student has no interest or care for others' feelings? Students, EAs, teachers, all of the above. Right, I didn't mention that one. So sometimes you have students who are oblivious to other people's feelings, and then there are those who intentionally make a point of saying, I don't care. And I think some of them are looking to reject so that they can't be rejected. I think some of them, it's just safer for them to do it first. Others, they might be underdeveloped in that area. So whether there's a diagnosis behind that motivation, or something else, maybe some history, some experiences that they've had. So they need to be taught about that. And I would say, again, access your team about how you go about teaching a child who doesn't care, who isn't motivated to care. And I think there are ways to do it, but it's a process and it's not a one-day fix, that's for sure. And also, if you can bring it back to them when there are moments or windows of when they do care, or when it has really benefited them that others care about them. And so being able to point out, here is why we as humans operate best in communities. But good question. That's a tough one. Okay, so the next one that I'm going to try to address is building capacity. So I have a picture there about we'd like to teach everyone to fish rather than just giving people fish. And the idea here is that if we can teach students in such a way that empowers them, increases their capacity to deal with their own behaviors and to be more independent, we do ourselves a favor. We reduce the demand on our jobs, but we also do them a favor going forward in their journey through life and finding a niche in our society. Because when they graduate, we're really hoping that they're much farther along in this journey of managing their behavior. So some ideas on that. I think I kind of addressed this already, but again, just in the busyness of a school, maybe questioning whether everybody is up to date on everything that's happened so far. You'll get through a day and you'll feel really good about managing everything and keeping your head above the water. And then realize that maybe not everyone knows what's happened. So just kind of keeping everybody in the loop. And if this is a student who is showing sort of a pattern of behavior, or their behavior is starting to become a safety concern, making sure the bigger team of learning support and administration is also in the loop. How to advocate for students. So here are things to bring up. I know that in the learning team, educational assistants don't necessarily get to decide these things in isolation, but I think you could play a role in just bringing them up to the team and saying, hey, what about this? Should we consider this? Just to get people's brains going in other directions when they get stuck. So to prevent students from falling through cracks, here's a few ideas. Asking about CRM, KITE, and RASP. CRM, my understanding, although I haven't participated in one, is where staff get together and they bring forward names of students they're concerned about, and people put their heads together and try to brainstorm ideas on what can be done going forward. I know that some schools have different names for CRMs. It's not always that name, but I believe every school has one. So that's what I'm referring to there. Hopefully everybody knows. The KITE, I've addressed that. So just questioning whether a KITE needs to be filled out for a student to help keep everybody in the loop on what are their triggers, what does escalation look like, what are the things we've found that are really successful. It's a place of documenting all that information. And the RASP, Risk Assessment Safety Plan, some of you may have seen these, some of you may have not, is basically a plan for a student who, when they are at peak, are a danger to themselves and others. So it can be part of the KITE, a supporting document for the KITE, basically just addressing peak. So asking whether this student needs that. Second one I've got is asking about parent perspective. So just wondering about who is communicating with parents? What are parents saying? What are parents' theories on why this is happening? And who is the key point person for communicating with parents? And how's it going? And then third, if you're able to, offering to gather data on triggers, people present, time of day of the week, the subject, that was going on when there was an escalation. Sensory factors, so things like noise, visual pieces, tactile pieces, the chaos in the room, and then frequency, intensity, and duration. So frequency is how often, intensity is how extreme, and duration is how long does it last. So in my experiences, I've read a lot of anecdotal notes written by educational assistants, and they're done well, and it looks like a lot of time went into writing them. But here are the things that I'm looking for when I read those anecdotals. And so you might want to consider going forward just tracking those things rather than writing an anecdotal. I do believe that these things can be tracked in a more efficient manner. There's some forms out there that you can use to track these. I have a resource that I'm going to share in resources that has some ideas about forms if the learning team wants to go in that direction. You can also ask me. I have forms created already, so your team can reach out to me and ask for them. I'm happy to share them. And then finally, just paying attention to eating, sleeping, medication, family events, peer relationships, staff relationships, all those things can factor into how their coping is. And so keeping track of maybe what students are telling you or what parents are telling you, because they can sometimes be the source of the issue. And then finally, paying attention to exceptions to the behavior. So if a student is functioning really well, asking why are they doing so well in this moment that is so great about this situation, and how can we make it happen again? There's the kite again. I won't talk anymore about that. I think I've covered it. Here is a risk assessment safety plan example. I'm just noticing the time, and I don't think I will click on it now, but if you're interested in seeing it, you're welcome to ask me and I will share it with you. And then consequences, I feel like I have addressed that too. Just my personal opinion, and you're welcome to debate with me, is that there is a place for consequences, even when students are out of control and it's quite obvious that they can't control or direct their behavior. I still think there is a place for repairing relationships, saying sorry, cleaning up messes. And it's a bit of a fine line because you want to do that without them feeling shame or guilt, or being punished for something they can't control. But I believe that society is set up that we take responsibility for our actions, and so I think we should prepare them for that. And then supporting the family. So these questions are more about the communication that is going home. Is your perspective being shared? My experience is that EAs are not usually the ones calling home. Sometimes these families can be tricky, and so it's administration doing it. But is your information being shared? Because as educational assistants, I feel like you get to know students really well. Your perspective is very insightful. It's very helpful. And so making sure that your insights are being communicated. And then also ensuring that there are positive things going home so that not every call is negative, because again, we run the risk of relationships. And when we have good relationships with these families, things are just so much better for everybody. And then finally, just increasing objectivity. Trying to acknowledge that it's very tricky to be part of a critical incident without coming out with your own physical or emotional bruises. And so being able and giving permission to take a step back and ask what you need in order to continue doing your job and being your best self. And so sometimes that means advocating for a break, whether it's an hour or a day, sharing with someone your experiences in a place where you have confidentiality and you have respect and you have someone who will ask you the right questions, but also affirm your suffering. And just having permission to slow it down and consider what is the next best thing. I've seen a lot of educational assistants sort of sacrifice themselves by throwing themselves right back into the chaos. And although I admire that, I worry about how that will go in the long run. And so, yeah, just reflecting on those pieces. And so I also put Erin Manning's name in here. If you're not aware of her, she is our staff wellness support person. She works at a division office, but she is a confidential resource that you can feel safe about calling and saying, hey, I've got this thing on my plate. Can I talk to you about it? And she can offer you that space and also offer additional resources. I believe she came before me, but not that long before me. So she might be a resource you're not aware of. So I thought I'd bring her up. Okay, I'll just quickly check in with questions. Okay, I don't think there's anything new there. So I'll go back to the final part of my presentation. Again, know that if, as we come up to the hour mark, you need to go, you have my blessing. These are tricky times and it's hard to manage everything. Okay. Resources, the last piece. Okay, so the first thing I've got here is a video. And I'm going to skip it just because I can't play it for you for the sound, and we are getting short on time. But here's the link to it if you're interested. If you go to Anxiety Canada and put in Anxiety Explained for Kids, it should come up. I put some anxiety resources in here because I believe that anxiety is often behind complex behavior. We've got lots of anxious kids out there. And so this video tries to explain to about a grade 3 level that anxiety can be normal, and it can also not only hurt our efforts, but also try to keep us safe. The next one I've got here is using picture books. So this is maybe a passion of mine. I find that there are a lot of picture books out there that touch on tricky subjects. And so I find that students will often be willing to process like grief and loss, anxiety and worry, what it means to be a good friend, what does it mean to have difficult behaviors that not everyone understands. These things are easier to process if you do it through a character in a book rather than speaking from the first person. So please send me any that I'm missing from my list. There's lots out there, but here's a few. I recently taught high school, and believe it or not, I used some of these children's books with my grade 11 students, and they absolutely loved it. So don't be afraid to try it with a variety of age groups, even though typically illustrated books are for our younger kiddos. Functional assessment, here is the link to that resource that has some ideas on forms for gathering data on triggers, intensity, frequency, duration, etc. It is open to the public. It's on the web. It was created a while ago, but there are some good, efficient ideas there on gathering data and trying to get to the understanding when it comes to complex behavior. Here's an article on mindfulness in the classroom. It is written for someone who doesn't know a lot about mindfulness and doesn't have a lot of time or prep. So if you were interested and wanted to take a small group of students or maybe even lead the whole class in a mindfulness exercise, this is an article that is a great start. And I do believe, in the research supports it, that mindfulness activities throughout the day can really help students to regulate. Deep pressure activities. This is an article on sensory. We often think of sensory as ways that students can escalate. They will have triggers that are sensory, but you can also think about sensory as a soothing tool. And so this article starts that topic off with a few ideas. If you want to speak more about that, your occupational therapist is probably your best resource on. It's gaining a lot more attention these days, that's for sure. Here's another book, or another resource, I should say, on anxiety. It's written by Aureen Pinto-Wagner, and it's written about children, but I really love the language she uses. It's very easy to follow and very applicable to school. So if you're interested in that topic, I highly recommend that book. I have used it many a time. Co-regulation, I feel like as educational assistants, many of you already do this and do it well, and maybe you don't even realize that you do it. The idea is when children are born, this is what mothers do. They teach babies and toddlers how to regulate by being in relationship and by modeling how to do it. And what we're finding is we have a lot of kiddos who are beyond toddlerhood, who are in elementary and even high school, who don't know how to regulate, whether it's because of trauma or their background. They really struggle to do it on their own. And so co-regulation is a place to start as they move to more independent regulation. So there's an article on that. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'll just check the questions again. I don't see any there. I just want to thank everybody for joining me. I haven't gotten to hang out with adults in a long time, and although we're not in a physical room together, this is kind of exciting to have these kinds of chats because a lot of it has been with my own children as of late. This video will be made available on the hub, and all the future videos will also be made available. So if you missed something, you want to share it with another Chinook's Edge employee, you can. Also, the Excel spreadsheet where you signed up, we will continue to add tabs for more presentations, but please know that we will also continue to send out more emails, so you won't miss it. The emails will let you know when they're happening. So thank you, everyone. I think I will sign off. I hope everyone is well and staying healthy out there, and I hope to see you in a physical classroom very soon.